Oil's headed a lot higher. The dollar's headed a lot lower. That inflation's going to continue to surge. We're going to be at 4 or 5% the next couple of months. But even where we are now, that would normally support a 6 or 7% long-term bond yield. Right now, most of the treasuries are at a level where you can't earn enough money to stay ahead of inflation. And under those circumstances, people tend to go out and start buying the stuff that they're going to need that they can maybe hold for a little bit because it's going to go up more in inflation than they're going to be able to get in other investments. And when that happens, you start to see people not holding onto the dollars, increasing the velocity. The turnover of the money, which all tends to feed into a higher inflation, becomes something of a self-fulfilling prophecy there. We're already in an inflationary environment, and it's going to get a lot worse.
And something I need to point out here is you just mentioned the year-over-year CPU figures are 3.2%, and I think that figure is going higher. So if you were an investor buying a 10-year treasury at 3.05%, you are getting almost 15 basis points below the rate of inflation, and that's before you owe and pay your taxes. If you pay a third of that in taxes, you're getting a little over 2%.
Right.
With the inflation rate at 3.2. So it's like death by 1,000 small cuts because, I've heard the deflationists make all kinds of very articulate arguments for deflation, John, but if we want to count deflation in terms of how most people count it today, falling prices or rising prices, we had a brief bit of it in CPI in 1954 when Eisenhower was president, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think we had like 2 or 3 months of negative CPI in 2008, but that's been it.
Well, that was as they reported it, and it was about as bad as it was back in the 50s. It was not a major deflation, and if you look at the way the CPI used to be measured, where it was intended as really the measure of the cost of living, of maintaining a constant standard of living, you never had deflation. It always stayed positive. That's in the 2008-9 period. We never had a real deflation. Most people indeed look at inflation as in terms of prices for consumer goods and services. That's the way I'm defining it. There are people who look at deflation in terms of whether the money supply is growing or shrinking. That's nice academically, but it doesn't have that much application in the day-to-day real world with people who have to figure out what they're going to earn or the type of investment return they're going to look for. You also have people who look at it from an asset inflation or deflation standpoint, where perhaps you're looking at the stock market. I mean, the stock market here could fall sharply, but that would not be at all inconsistent with an inflation in terms of prices for consumer goods and services. It's consumer goods and services that you need to look at in terms of where yields are going, and usually historically has been the basis for the level of interest rates. Again, long-term interest rates usually ride 3.5 percentage points above the rate of consumer inflation.
John, one of the things that I think in a service that you provide that I think is very important, it used to be, if we were going back 25, 30 years ago, you could take the numbers the government gave you, GDP, inflation, the unemployment rate, you could take them almost as gospel. Over the years, we have modified GDP, we've modified the way we report inflation, we've modified the way we report unemployment. In fact, one thing that disturbed me in the President's Deficit Reduction Commission, there was a proposal in the very back that we need to reformulate CPI the way it's reported because we're overstating inflation. So that tells me they have more tricks up their sleeve when it comes to COLAs and things like that. If we can basically restate how we measure it, I don't know, you know all the games they play.
They had a suggested measure, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics has been publishing an experimental measure for some years now called the chain-weighted CPIU. And it's fully substitution-based, which is from the standpoint of steak gets too expensive, people tend to buy more hamburger or more chicken. That's what they're talking about when they say that current CPI overstates inflation. Well, they've changed the CPI enough so that they've been able to knock most of the fixed basket of goods effect out of there made it somewhat parallel to a substitution-based index, at least in terms of the magnitude of change. If you look at what's being reported now with the CPI and the chain-weighted measure, there's another 0.5% or 0.5%, 0.8 of a percentage point that could be knocked off on an annual basis by going to the chain-weighted CPI. That's what they want to do. The idea generally is very specifically, the Budget Commission was looking at it, was to reduce the cost of living adjustments that the government has to pay. That's why they changed the numbers back in the 1990s. But that's not what the CPI was ever intended to be. It just became a tool for reducing deficits for the politicians where no one dared vote against Social Security. We started with this conversation as opposed to giving people an honest measure of inflation. And if you look at it the way the CPI was measured in 1990, inflation today, instead of running a little over 3%, is approaching 7%. And if you look at it the way it was measured back in 1980, you're looking at something that's over 10%.
This is something that I think it was in the book I read, Dying of Money, Genzo Parsons talked about, that unfortunately the public will vote for politicians that promise them a free lunch, when in reality the politicians are paying for that lunch through the hidden tax of inflation, so they're picking their pockets.
Yep. Again, there's going to be severe financial pain, which the pocketbook issues do tend to be the primary drivers when people are suffering. That may be enough to change the system, but not until the 2012 election. And if you want to get good people in there that are going to make a difference, that's something that's got to be worked on now, not trying to just replace the existing people or re-elect the existing people who are playing the political game, as opposed to looking at the long-term welfare of the and now what I would contend is even short-term welfare of the nation and the American people as a whole.
You know, John, we were starting this conversation, I said, do you think these people really know? And sometimes what is one of the most frightening things to me is to watch when Bernanke goes on Capitol Hill before the Senate Finance Committee and the one in the Senate, and to listen to the type of questions. Now, granted, this is on camera, so there may be some theatrics there, but literally some dumb questions that, you know, I really get the feeling that there is a degree of greater monetary illiteracy today in terms of what's inflation, what causes it, what's behind it, than it was 30-something years ago. And the best example, John, you remember this, in the late 70s, we used to call them the M&Ms, when every Thursday or whenever the money supply figures came out, M2, M3, we used to watch them, and if they went up, you'd see the bond market tank, you would see trouble in the stock market, the price of gold would go up. Bernanke holds a press conference and basically calls it quantitative easing, which is a euphemism for, hey, we're going to print a whole bunch of money in the bond market. The only guy I've seen maybe perhaps react at a professional level has been Bill Gross, who's basically said, we're out of treasuries.
Well, he's about as big an investor there as you get. The average politician may not understand it. I mean, a lot of them are, you know, they're just average people. The press certainly plays games. The Fed and Wall Street all play games in terms of what's happening, and there are a lot of special interests that get involved. It's just a system that unfortunately does not lend itself to self-righting at the moment. When times are good, the average guy doesn't care how corrupt the politicians are as long as he's doing okay. When he starts to feel the economic pain, then he starts to pay a little more attention, and that's when you tend to get the political change. There's going to be political change here. I just don't know if it's going to be in time. In fact, I would contend that it's not going to be in time to prevent the hyperinflation.
You know, that's almost the same feeling that I was getting. I thought, you know, when the president appointed a deficit reduction commission, they came out with the results, and then he went on the stump and he says, you know, we're going to get this thing under control. And the first guy that comes along is Paul Ryan. He comes out with a plan, yep, and he's immediately attacked and demagogued. And even the deficit commission, when I was talking to Senator Simpson last week, he was telling me everywhere they go, when they get in front of the American public and they talk to people and explain the situation without the press trying to spin it, the American public understands it. And I think Churchill once said, Americans will try all the wrong things first, and in the end they'll do what's right. But I'm afraid from what I'm seeing here, we're going to do everything wrong before. I just can't help but believe, John, and maybe you feel this way, that we're going to wake up one day and we're going to have our Greek moment where they're not going to be able to kick the can. It's going to be forced upon us.
I'm afraid that's going to happen. I mean, there are a lot of people who indeed either understand or can understand who listen to the circumstance, and most people, I think, that I've talked with are willing to sacrifice to have something work out. They're not necessarily the average individual, and they're sure not the average politician. The average politician, again, plays to what he thinks his audience is.
Well, John, I'll tell you, keep up the good work. Tell our listeners, because you report GDP the way it used to be, you report unemployment the way it actually is versus the phony numbers we get once a month, and also you're tracking M3 and also the inflation rate in the way that we used to measure them.
Well, you keep up your good work too, Jim. I mean, you're getting a lot of important information out to the public.
Well, tell them about your website and what they're going to find there.
My website is shadowstats.com. We have a lot of information available there to the public, including descriptions of the background of the key economic series and graphics in terms of the alternative measures. I have a hyperinflation report that's available to the public there. It's on the right-hand column of the homepage. Again, shadowstats.com. And if anyone is interested in subscribing, I always like to pick up new subscribers. There are details on the homepage for doing that as well.
And John, also tell them about, you have, which I think is very important, the very numbers that the big economic numbers we report each month, the unemployment rate, the GDP numbers. You have a primer on that. Tell our listeners about that, because I think it's very important when they get these numbers and they go, you know what? That doesn't sound like what I'm experiencing personally when I go to the store or the gas pump.
I mean, I've been a consulting economist for 30 years, and over time, I have found increasingly that the common experience has moved away from what the government's reporting, or the government's reporting moves away from the common experience. And what's happened generally is that there have been methodological changes that have been made to the various series that tend to put upside biases into the economic reporting, downside biases into inflation. I gave you the inflation numbers earlier. Well, the unemployment rate, if you went around the country, asked everyone if he or she were unemployed and didn't use the more restrictive definitions that the government uses today and has used all along, they just have six levels of unemployment that they report, U3 being the headline number. Their broadest measure now measures something close to 17%. I had in what I'm estimating has been eliminated since 1994. These are the long-term discouraged workers, people who've been out of work for an extended period of time and haven't looked for a job in more than a year. But they take a job, they want a job, they meet all the other qualifications of being unemployed. On that basis, unemployment's around 22% instead of 9% the government's reporting. And the GDP largely tied to the way the inflation numbers are given. It's not the same inflation measure that's used in the CPI, but a lot of the same principles are applied. And if the higher the rate of inflation that you use and deflating the GDP, putting it into a constant dollar measure, which is the way it gets reported, the higher the inflation used, the weaker the growth. The lower the inflation used, the stronger the growth. You're using very low inflation numbers, artificially low, and you get artificially strong growth. The difference is the economy is still contracting.
And I think that's probably why when you look at the public opinion polls, the politicians gripe like, why aren't you happier, or why isn't public sentiment up? I think it's because the reality is people aren't working, or they're working below what they used to work at. Maybe they're working part-time. And then they're also experiencing, on a reality basis, every month, every week, they go to the grocery store, fill their car with gas, pay their insurance premiums. Yep. All that stuff is going up. Well, John, give out your website one more time as we close, if you would.
Sure. Shadowstats.com. And everyone a sense as to what's really happening with economic statistics, go with your own experience. I trust the average person's experience over the government's reporting anytime.
I couldn't agree more. Well, John, listen, always keep up the great work, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me, Jim.